So let's talk about Barricades, Ruins and surprisingly easy cover saves, with an overview of how terrain works in 10th edition 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking terrain and scenery on the battlefields of the 41st millennium, and a few of the subtleties as to how it works as your soldiers are fighting over it. This video is one that I've had requested for quite a while on the channel. I probably should have got around to it earlier in the edition, given that the exact interactions of terrain and scenery pieces do seem to be one of the things that trip people up most in the game. The rules written by Games Workshop I do think are at least fairly clear, but it's maybe more the applying of those rules to people's actual physical terrain sets that they already have and they play over can make things a bit less obvious, and some house rules can start to creep in as well. At least for people playing a whole variety of opponents and on different battlefields, I wouldn't be too surprised if there wasn't some sort of minor confusion as to how certain terrain pieces work. I feel like half the battle of getting terrain right in Warhammer 40k is just to have a really good grasp of the core rules, and not get yourself in a situation where you think that a unit might be hidden and your opponent thinks otherwise, and perhaps get used to talking through a few common areas of contention with ruins and things before the game begins. In this video I'm going to focus more on the core rules for playing terrain in Warhammer 40k, going through why it's important, a few example battlefields, and then the core rules for terrain in general and specific pieces. Maybe I might do a follow-up video at some point with slightly more in-depth terrain tactics in 40k, just to underline a few of the options that you can do with blocking line of sight and a few other terrain things. Otherwise, let me know if you'd like to see that down in the comments. In any case though, jumping into it, terrain's really important to get right in Warhammer 40k, as without it you're basically playing really quite a simplistic game where everyone's out in the open and the only real thing that matters is how close range you get to the enemy. In general, it's a big factor of balancing between things like shooting and melee armies or close range shooting armies that need to hide and get close. And depending on the battlefield that you play on, less terrain will mean more shooting advantage in general, both from things that can hide out of line of sight and also getting the benefit of cover against enemy shooting attacks. Having a good amount of terrain on the board makes moving and positioning more important, and having obscuring terrain like ruins on the board I think is the most important thing to have, allowing players to hide valuable units so they don't just get shot off the board turn 1, and helps to blunt the Alpha Strike effect where you have one player goes first getting a big advantage. If you're playing on a board with slightly too light terrain, then you're generally going to have more of a go first advantage if you're playing with a gunline type army. It's obviously all very important for more themed and narrative games as well. You can set up the terrain to have the general feel of the location that you're fighting in, hopefully while still keeping it functional from a more game mechanic point of view. Here are just a few example battlefields. I think that in general in 40k, if anything, people tend to play on battlefields that are maybe a little bit too light with terrain, partly just due to the things that they've got available. This Games Workshop one seems quite nice. It's got a good amount of obscuring ruins, plus some smaller pieces in those Munitorum containers that you might be able to gain cover from or hide smaller units behind, while I still consider this one a fairly open one with good firing lanes across the board. Here's one example of Games Workshop competitive terrain from this edition. They've put the ruins on perspex bases to show where the boundary of the terrain lies. That is kind of important for 9th edition ruins, as we'll get onto. And again, there's a good amount of line of sight blocking ruins here. For better or worse, they do tend to be the most commonly played terrain piece, just because they're a bit more functional, blocking line of sight and granting cover and things, compared with plenty of other terrain pieces that might still allow you very easy lines of sight, even if the board does feel relatively dense. Here's one terrain map from a WTC table, an independent tournament circuit that typically has tables set out with pre-measured terrain. This one goes very heavy on the ruins with 6 smaller ones and 4 big ones, plus a few other bits as well. I'd imagine that this one will be much denser than most casual games out there, and often tends to be set up so you've got some objectives that it's quite possible to hide units on, and some where it's not so much, and you have to venture out into the midfield to hold them. Finally, here's an example of a terrain set that looks really quite cool, but is probably a lot less functional. It doesn't really have many things that block line of sight, so if you've got a bunch of ranged units here, they're probably going to have a shooting field day. Lots of things are going to be getting cover saves, but you'll be able to draw a bead on quite a lot of things, and that could be bad news for any, say, more fragile melee troops who are just going to get shot off the board before they get close. Still looks very cool, of course. Could still be good for some narrative games where opponents are trying to make sure that the game is quite balanced between two people, though I wouldn't say this one's particularly ideal for more competitive things. Having taken a look at a few boards, let's talk about some core terrain rules and then move forward to the different sorts of terrain and how they interact with cover saves. The main thing that terrain just in general does that's more governed by the standard bits of the rulebook is help determine visibility. It can be relevant for movement when you go up and down and over it, and the vast majority of terrain pieces will help you grant the benefit of cover in some way, which has its own rules for saving throws. First up, visibility is generally fairly intuitive in Warhammer 40k. Games Workshop do have diagrams in their rulebook, just highlighting the difference between fully visible and partially visible and likely to be getting a cover save. When you're taking line of sight from a single model to these guys to see what's visible and what isn't, you're allowed to draw that line of sight from any point on the model, even if it's, say, a weird corner of a tank or something like that, to check visibility. You don't have to draw it from anywhere more central or the worst possible angle. If from that best possible angle though, then the model or the unit is at least partially obscured, then you can't say it's fully visible, and that is relevant for cover saves and things. That's generally used to grant the benefit of cover to the enemy, at least for a lot of normal terrain pieces like ruins and battlefield debris and hills and things. Models that aren't fully visible due to a terrain feature can gain the benefit of cover. It's not literally every terrain feature that grants this. Say for example, craters only help out for infantry, but most of the others will grant it to most things. The benefit of cover adds +1 to your saving throw, so it's generally going to make your units tougher to kill at range. Obviously one still fail, and they do have that very specific rule, meaning that you can't improve an armor saver 3+ to a 2+ against an AP 0 attack. So no having Space Marines or Sisters of Battle saving on a 2+ because they're in cover these days. I sometimes see that confusing people for higher saves. Say a 2+ armor save against AP 1, that'd still be saving on a 2+. Otherwise, terrain can be important for movement. The general rule in the movement phase is that if a terrain feature is less than 2 inches in height, you basically get to move straight through it without disrupting your movement. Say they give this example of the Von Ryan's Leaper going through this fuel pipe, but then when he gets to climb a ledge that's 3 inches tall to get to the top of a small building, that will be counted as part of the move, so you need to measure the 3-inch uppage and take that off his total movement characteristic, so that is going to slow him down quite a bit. Fly units in 10th edition move diagonally. They can move straight through and over enemy units, as seen by the diagram with the Terminators here, but still need to move up, down and over terrain these days, unless there's some sort of special interaction, say like ruins. Weirdly, it's not properly set out by the core rules, but they added more in their designer's commentary, just showing what happens if a fly unit moves over a terrain piece like this. The way is that you move up to the top of it, then you move horizontally and measure that distance, and then you measure diagonally back down again. Realistically meaning that for a lot of fly units going over any sort of tall terrain, there's at least a good chance it might be a shorter distance to go around it rather than over it. They also have this diagram for models moving over a terrain piece that's a bit more random and not the same uniform height. Basically each model has to move up to the gap where they can fit their base in best. So the one on the left has to go all the way up to the top, the one in the middle can go to about halfway up that Munitorum container, and the one on the right doesn't have to move so far, and then move diagonally downwards back to the floor below after they've done that, as the Tyranid Prime did in the previous example. With those basics out of the way, let's actually get into the types of terrain features in general. Listed in the rulebook, there's 6 main types, and there is a bit of overlap between at least some of them. Craters and rubble, battlefield debris, statuary, hills, industrial structures, sealed buildings, and armoured containers, barricades and fuel pipes, woods, and then of course ruins, by far the most complicated, and as we've seen in the example tables, probably some of the most common. Starting with craters and rubble, they're some of the most simple. They only give the benefit of cover to infantry, and only if the models are wholly within this terrain feature. So if the model is partially in and partly not within, they wouldn't be able to gain that benefit. This one's generally simple enough, but there's often still a little bit of confusion as to what wholly within versus just within means. In general in 40k, if you've got any part of the base at least partially within, you could say that the unit's within that terrain feature, but not every model would necessarily be, given that there could be some outside of it. On a model by model basis for these craters, for each model to be wholly within, you'd have to have the entirety of the base not overlapping the edge of the craters. So say for example the unit at sea, 4 of them could claim the benefit of cover, but one of those termagants wouldn't be able to if this was a crater. Next up, there's 2 kind of similar classes, battlefield debris and statuary, and the hills and enclosed buildings type 1. The only real difference between the 2 of them is that you can't end movement on top of the battlefield debris class, but you can on the others, as they're more terrain pieces that are clearly made to have models stand on top of them. The way that these hand out cover is that each time a ranged attack is allocated to a model, if that model is not fully visible to every model in the attacking unit, then the model gains the benefit of cover against that attack. It basically sort of means that these sort of terrain pieces kind of cast a shadow where behind them things that are partially obscured will be able to gain the benefit of cover, and you're maybe a little bit more likely to be able to get that if you're right up close to the piece as opposed to really quite a long way back, though theoretically that could still give you the benefit of cover. I think it's easiest to illustrate that with some examples, but here's the other class just while we're on the subject. This one is hills, industrial structures, steel buildings, and armoured containers. It's basically the same rules as the previous class, and they basically just add movement rules to them, saying that you can set models up on top of it or end a move on top of it, provided no part of the base overhangs the terrain feature. So basically there has to be enough room for the models that you want to put on top of them, and they have to be in the normal coherency, usually 2 inches distance horizontally and 5 inches vertically. I feel like another common area of confusion that I see played wrong quite a bit is exactly who gets cover in a unit and how you treat it in terms of rolling saves. Here's a really simple example with one Havoc firing at a unit of Space Marines, and in the middle we've got a wall that's tall enough to be able to hide those Space Marines. Maybe it could be part of a ruin that is treated in a similar sort of way to the above, for granting the benefit of cover, or maybe it could just be some battlefield debris. When checking who's fully visible and who isn't, you can draw that line of sight from any part on the Havoc model, and that means that easily the Space Marine on the left, he won't be getting cover as he's clearly fully visible to the Havoc, but it looks like the one in the middle will, given that even if you draw the line of sight from the absolute edge of the Havoc's base, you still can't see the entire model there, so he'll get cover. When the Havoc starts shooting and the Space Marine player has to roll some saves, it would usually make sense for the Space Marine player to take those saves first on the Space Marines that do get the benefit of cover, as they're going to have the best save and the best chance of surviving, and hopefully take very little or no damage for the squad to strike back next turn, rather than taking your first saves on the one without cover, which is going to be lower and give you the higher chance of losing the model this turn. If you're taking loads of saves this way, they need to be slow rolled. Say if these Marines took 12 attacks at AP -2, the cover save would mean that they get a 4+ save overall, and you couldn't just roll all those 12 dice on a 4+, as that would basically mean that you're getting the 4+ save on the guy on the left as well, and that's not allowed as he's fully visible. If those 12 dice were damage 1 attacks, you could roll the first 4 together for these Space Marines as they have 2 wounds, and just roll the maximum amount of cover wounds that you could lose over and over again until there's none left, or you have to move on to things with a worse save. Perhaps one of the less intuitive parts of cover saves in 10th edition is that if the enemy is being shot by a squad with multiple models, you determine the cover save for all of them by basically the least good model at seeing them, and if all the Space Marines are at least partially obscured by terrain against at least one of the models firing at them, then they will get cover. In this example we've got 3 Havocs, and even though the guy on the left is completely fully visible to the 2 Havocs on the left, because he isn't fully visible to the 3rd Havoc, he is still going to get a cover save against the entire unit's attacks. It does mean that cover saves are handed out kind of generously in 40k. I feel like in that sort of partial obscure sort of thing it can still be kind of intuitive, though in more extreme examples sometimes it can be a bit weird. Say for example the Havocs have moved up, one of them was still caught behind a wall and unable to see. If that's a ruined wall or battlefield debris or things that grant the cover in the way that we talked about above, then it means that even if he's not firing and the rest of the Havocs have got a completely free and unobstructed view to their target, who's completely out in the open, those models will all still get the benefit of cover. As by the rules, they're not visible to every model in the attacking unit, as one of them just can't see. That does also apply if the other unit wouldn't have even been in range or would have been trying to attack them either. Say the Havocs with an attached Warpsmith, the Warpsmith might have been out of range of the Space Marines, but still because he can't see them, they're still going to gain cover from the rest of the squad. In general that means it's going to be a bit easier to gain cover saves against big multi-model units versus say individual vehicles. At least for big and shooty individual models firing, they can just take the one line of sight from anywhere on their model or hull. So there's Chaos Predator set up in a somewhat similar way to that original 3-model Havoc squad. Will only have the enemy have a cover save on the guy on the right, as the other 2 are still fully visible if you take the line of sight from the corner of the model. In the same sort of way, in 10th edition, vehicles and monsters will generally find it very, very easy to get a cover save, and might often do so accidentally. For them not to get a cover save, they have to be absolutely fully visible for every part of their model to the thing that's trying to shoot them. Often that's not going to be the case if you're taking pot shots at them across the board. So say for example with this Screamer Killer Carnifex advancing up the board, if you just make it so they tow part of their base, or even one of those big long outstretched claws behind a bit of cover, they will get the benefit of cover bonus to their save. which can be quite a big deal to big scary monsters with big saves. This one maybe does feel a bit weird and slightly unintuitive to people, though I'd say it's a bit of an abstraction. Cover saves in 10th edition are just generous, and it means that you're probably going to be getting cover saves more often than not, and maybe represents them doing a little bit of their movement in a more sort of abstract sense, moving up behind bits of terrain and then breaking out to attack the enemy, in a way that the turn-by-turn movement doesn't really encapsulate all that well in 40k. Another thing that I've seen people maybe not take advantage of quite so much are Titanic units getting cover saves. Titanic units aren't treated any differently to any other models, and with such big profiles they're often some of the easiest things to get cover saves on. The opponent needs to see basically every single inch of a pretty massive model and not have any of it partially obscured for them not to gain the benefit of cover, so it isn't really all that hard most of the time. Otherwise, we've got barricades and fuel pipes, generally able to be moved over without penalty given that they're less than 2 inches in height normally. The main way that they can get in the way is that you can't finish a move on top of them, which can often mean that you might not be able to clear them, particularly if there's some enemy models in the way. They give the benefit of cover to infantry wholly within 3 inches of the terrain feature, presuming they also fulfill that same sort of cover criteria, with the model taking the saving throw being at least partially obscured by the barricade to at least one model in the firing unit. Otherwise fairly straightforward. If you're not infantry and you're outside that range, then you don't get cover from these things. And they also have a rule where you can charge enemies that are on the other side of the terrain feature and end up within 2 inches of them rather than 1 inches, just to make you able to fight across the barricade a little bit easier. This doesn't mean that it extends engagement range by that amount, so come the next enemy's turn they might be able to shoot normally and move normally if they want to, so there can be some advantages to setting up behind them. At least in theory land they do make it a bit easier to resist a charge, at least if the opponent can't cross the barricade in any easy way. For woods in 10th edition, they're considered to have a predefined footprint, so you need to work out what that footprint is at the start of the game, which bits are going to be considered in the woods and which bits are going to be considered out. They don't really have any special rules for blocking full line of sight in the same way that ruins do, but within that footprint of terrain, basically anything that's seeing it through or into it means that you don't get full visibility on that unit, so you're usually going to be getting the benefit of cover very, very easily. If you're a model inside the woods and getting shot from outside, you get the benefit of cover if you're wholly within it. And if you're a model behind the woods and the enemy can still draw some physical lines of sight through, they can still shoot them. But even if any models do wind up being fully visible, they still count as partially obscured and gaining the benefit of cover. Models that have taken up residence within the woods and are wholly within it get to see out of it completely normally. So it means that at least in theory it could be kind of nice to have a heavy weapons squad hiding within the woods as they'd be gaining the benefits of cover, but anything that they're shooting wouldn't be gaining the benefits themselves. Finally, they do have the exception in the aircraft and towering rules are exceptions to this. If they're fully visible, then even if you're shooting them through some woods, they don't just gain the benefit of cover like the rest would. Finally though, let's get on to the last and perhaps most important terrain piece, which often tends to be very common in the battlefields of 40k, in the ruins. Games Workshop's definitely gone through a few different iterations as to how they treat them in game, 10th edition being a little bit different to 9th, though keeps a fair few of the same features. In 10th edition, ruins are considered to have a footprint, so an area that counts as the area terrain within the ruin, which is often one of the most important things to establish, as we'll get onto in a second. If the ruin's got a base and it's really clear, then sometimes it can be very obvious, but otherwise if the ruin doesn't have a base or has a very weirdly shaped one, it might be a bit less so. It is kind of important as well, as it determines what could be obscured or not. Otherwise, for movement through ruins, infantry and beast models can basically ghost through the walls, so ruin walls don't block your movement whatsoever, representing them going through doors and windows and things like that, though weirdly enough they didn't write that swarms get the same exemption, so they have to go round. And they also have rules for setting things up in the upper floors of ruins. Specifically, infantry, beasts, and fly models can all use their move to end up on the upper floor of a ruin, provided their base or any part of the model that would have contacted the ground doesn't overhang the ruin floor that they're trying to wind up on, which does mean that there might be a little bit less room for certain models than you might expect sometimes. As with other things, there's no special exemption for fly models going through ruins, so things like flying tanks and things still need to either go up and over or round, and unless the ruin's very short indeed, it usually means that you need to usually go round the ruin as the shortest way to get from A to B. So they really can get in the way of things like cavalry and mounted units and things like jet bikes. With movement around bits of terrain, it's important that people measure really quite carefully. And I feel like one of the more common movement mistakes is sort of cutting the corner a little bit and giving yourself just a bit more movement than you should normally be able to get. you really need to measure from the absolute tip of a model's corner that's going to take the longest distance to get round to it. So say with this Chaos Predator trying to go around this ruined wall, probably the most important bit to measure is the front corner that you can see on the right here. That bit needs to get all the way back round to the edge of the ruined wall, then use any movement to clear around it, and then the tank can start going down the other edge of the ruined wall if it wants to. And it does overall mean that the tank might be moving far less than you might expect to. It certainly gives things like infantry and beasts a big advantage when moving through terrain boards with lots of ruins on them, as they can usually get from A to B far faster, not having to go around things. Perhaps the single most important thing about ruins, though, is their visibility rules. In previous editions, this was called obscuring, but now it's just the visibility section on the ruin section of the rules. Basically saying that if you've got a model that's trying to draw line of sight from one side of a ruin all the way to the other side, and even if they can physically see the model, if you're drawing line of sight through that terrain piece, then typically line of sight is blocked. This generally applies to units that are both completely outside of the ruins. If you've got models that are at least within the ruin, then you can see them from the other side, and if they're wholly within, then they can see out. In the initial launch of 10th edition, it used to be that towering models were a complete exception to this and could bypass it completely, but Games Workshop rolled that back in the balanced data slate, so now the only units that ignore this particular rule are aircraft. They'll be able to see visibility to and from them completely normally, and don't get their line of sight blocked or blocked by ruins. For this one, I feel like it's a lot better to get the general idea by some diagrams, and Games Workshop did put some helpful ones in their designer's commentary. Here we've got a Space Marine repulsor tank, and the lines of sight to and from that it can get, the structure in the middle being a ruin that doesn't physically block line of sight, so you can get true line of sight to all three of these units, but as mentioned, the visibility rule sort of gets in the way to the ones on the other side. On the diagram on the left, of course, it can get normal lines of sight to the termagants that are completely out in the open. It can also get completely normal line of sight to and from the termagants that are wholly within the ruin. They'll likely be getting the benefit of cover, but the tank can still shoot them. But the tank's completely unable to shoot the termagants at point A. Neither the tank nor the termagants are wholly within the ruin, so they're safe from its firepower for now, and usually things that you set up just behind a ruin like that will be pretty safe from enemy firepower across the board. If, as with the next diagram, the tank moves wholly within the ruin, then it can both see and be seen by the termagants outside of it. It's basically taken up position within the ruin and can open fire with full effect. I think all of that makes quite a lot of sense, but this is the weirder interaction out of the ruins that I feel like quite a lot of people play wrong in one way or another. Basically the idea that if you have a unit that's partially within the ruin, like the Space Marine repulsor tank positioned here, where the tank is partially within but not wholly within, basically it can be seen by models on the other side of the ruin, but it can't actually see them. It means that in general, just towing into a ruin like this is usually a bit disadvantageous for the model in question. And often with bigger tanks and vehicles, they might not be able to physically move into or fit into the entire footprint of the ruin, so they're not really going to be able to use this sort of rule to be able to see out, as with the previous example. I believe this one's kind of counter to how it worked in 9th edition if memory serves right, so it maybe feels a bit unintuitive to plenty of people playing 10th. This is now the main thing that the towering rule does. If this model was instead an Imperial Knight with the towering keyword rather than a repulsor, then the Imperial Knight would be able to see the termagants at A due to towering, as basically the towering rule counters this specific situation, so if you tow into the cover, then you can see out of it. Basically though, mostly in 10th edition, tanks and vehicles and monsters are usually going to be getting more benefit from going round and outside ruins and gaining the line of sight that way, rather than trying to tow in and move through. Otherwise for ruins, they grant the benefit of cover in a similar sort of way to the battlefield debris, so to any models not fully visible to every model in the firing unit, but also gain it to anything wholly within the footprint of the ruin as well, including things like big tanks and monsters if they can fit their big bases entirely within the footprint of the ruin. Finally, they have a slightly seldom used rule called plunging fire. If you've got models that are wholly within the terrain feature and they're greater than 6 inches away from the ground, you get to increase their AP by 1 against any targets at ground level, which sometimes can be genuinely quite powerful. But depending on your terrain set, there might be literally no ruins that can actually satisfy that. And even then, it can sometimes have some big trade-offs. You might certainly be able to get a little bit more damage out of your unit, sometimes a meaningful amount, but it does mean that if they're that high up, they're not going to be able to reposition very quickly at all. They might be taking a full turn just to move down to ground level, let alone go any distance horizontally, so it does lock the unit in place and won't be very easy for taking objectives or gaining lines of sight if you didn't have one before. I feel like perhaps the most important thing that you can talk about pre-game with an opponent is to work out exactly how the ruins that are on your board will be used this game, as I've just had so many experiences with people either expecting them to be used a bit differently or not being entirely familiar with the exact way that the ruins are being used by the tournament pack, and certainly myself included sometimes. If your ruins don't have bases, you need to decide what sort of parts are being considered for the entire obscuring rule type thing. Are you saying that those ruins have got any sort of footprint at all, or are they literally just being the same footprint as the walls themselves? As the difference could be really quite a big difference. I've seen some people house rule that their ruins have, say, a 1 inch counts as base around every bit that touches the ground, and some people house rule that you basically get a square footprint of the ruin everywhere within the sort of corner angle that they get, maybe making a nice square box for the ruin, or making a triangle sort of footprint of the ruin, drawing the footprint from corner to corner. I say that's something that can be very important, and you absolutely should talk about pre-game, as it can be a big difference to where your units need to position themselves to be out of line of sight, which can be absolutely game-changing if the opponent can suddenly shoot them or not. For this one, I'm not really sure there's necessarily a right answer. There's definitely variation in play, and people tend to just like playing the way that they've done it before, so worth having that discussion with your opponent pre-game. There still can be some confusion if they're using bases as well. For example, take this ruin as an example, an MDF-1 made by TT Combat. This is an enormous great big corner ruin with 3 floors, and then it has a great big square of base, all of that seeming to be entirely within the footprint of the ruin, but then it can create a little bit of weirdness with, say, if you've got 2 units standing just behind this ruin and needing to draw their line of sight across the corner of it, which looks like it's open terrain basically here. Technically, rules as written, if you're counting that as the footprint of the overall ruin, say the Infernus Marine that's standing here wouldn't be able to see the Weird Boy and vice versa, even if this one does feel kind of unintuitive and a bit strange and abstract, as by the physical terrain on the board, they're nowhere near a ruin wall. By the core rules, that's the way that you should play, and it can mean that ruins obscure a little bit more line of sight than you might expect. Say if they've got a base that juts out, say, another inch or two from the end of a ruin, that bit can technically block line of sight as well. But I feel like the abstraction maybe is going a bit too far for certain ruins. Maybe if you've got a great big scenic one with an enormous base that extends far, far beyond the profile of the regular ruin itself, it might well be worth deciding whether or not you want that huge base to all be the footprint of that same ruin, or whether you want to house rule it a bit so the footprint's a bit smaller, just so it functions a bit better, maybe more as intended. For this big L-shaped ruin as well, I could certainly see 2 players deciding that the footprint of the ruin should just be, say, the triangle, drawing a line between the 2 corners of the ruin and say everything within that is in the footprint, but this bit at the back that sticks out might not be. That normally wouldn't be the case if you played at a tournament or something like that, but it's your terrain and you can decide how you're using it and what makes most sense for blocking line of sight and things. If you think that this is all a bit weird, having a weird boy and a space marine not be able to see each other across broadly open terrain, basically. I think the important thing here is just to discuss with your opponent about the ruins before you start, really, as it's just a bit annoying and awkward if a player moves something thinking they can get a line of sight when the other player thinks they can't, or vice versa. Often that'll wind up having one of the players being disadvantaged just due to the misunderstanding, which might be a perfectly valid one depending on the way that they played their own terrain at home. Otherwise, for ruins and pre-game discussions, it might well be worth having a think about what sort of gaps vehicles and monsters are supposed to be able to pass through on the board. I've certainly played games on quite a lot of preset tournament tables that in theory have very precise measurements for how far things should be from each other, but often the realities of the terrain when it gets on the table are that sometimes gaps can be a bit smaller than they could be depending on the exact terrain that you've got available, and there might be a little bit of theory craft depending on whether or not a vehicle or monster in theory should be able to fit through a gap, even if physically it might not be able to once you've got the terrain in place. In my experience at sort of smaller and mid-table tournaments and things, people are generally tending to be at least fairly forgiving of that. Though again, I think if you've got lots of big monsters and vehicles and things, it's worth talking about which gaps certain models will or won't be able to fit through. As on some tight tables, you might wind up with situations where certain bigger models just can't really get anywhere on the board, or have very narrow movement lanes, even when in theory they should be able to have a bit more freedom. Does definitely depend event to event, and sometimes on competitive tables, genuinely huge things like Titanic models might just not have much space to maneuver whatsoever, and that's just the way it's supposed to be. But I'd say that when setting up for particularly more casual games, it's worth just trying to establish movement lanes so things can broadly move up the board and function as you expect them to in the rules, and not just be completely hamstrung by having two ruins that are very slightly too close together, and there might be a centimetre or two's difference that you can't quite fit the outlying sponson of a big model through. I feel like most people in that case are kind of happy to hand wave it and allow the model to pass. Finally, as if that weren't enough for getting ruins sorted, one other thing that I've been caught out myself about before is whether or not there's any counts as enclosed rule going on. Certain tournament packs, or even people playing more casually, might house rule that the entire bottom floor of all ruins just counts as completely enclosed, and any windows and things just count as shut. So even if the models are entirely within the footprint of the ruin, they can't see in and out through those gaps, just literally to increase the level of line of sight blocking on the table. Maybe mean that you just don't need an entire new terrain set if you want to do that, or physically have to board up all the windows or things which might ruin the look of a piece. Particularly at tournaments and things, it's worth checking out whether or not that sort of rule is in effect, if everything's literally just been played as is and any windows do indeed count as open. Or in this particular tournament pack, everything counts as enclosed, and you're not getting line of sight through things even if you're right on the other side of the wall within the ruins profile. I think all of that put together doesn't really need to take too long. You just need to establish where the ruins' footprints are, make sure that those full footprints are indeed used for the entire obscuring rule and blocking line of sight, check what sort of gaps your biggest monsters and vehicles are allowed to move through, and if you're in a tournament, check if there's any sort of rules that count the bottom floor of every ruin as enclosed or similar. In any case though, I think we'll leave that there for today. Hope you've enjoyed a few thoughts on terrain in Warhammer 40k and how it works, and let me know any other thoughts or insights or things I might have missed down in the comments. It is a surprisingly big subject, and as I said, I've seen all sorts of local variation with how people like to play with stuff. As you can tell, particularly with ruins, I feel like that's one of the biggest challenges with getting everyone on a level playing field and not having anyone surprised for the negative. Hopefully I'll try and follow this up with a future video on a few basic thoughts as to using terrain tactics in 40k, and feel free to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see that, and otherwise I do just post Warhammer 40k videos just about every day, so check back later if you'd like to see more. Finally, if you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.